So thanks for being here. As you heard, Katja Obring, my name. And I want to talk about something that we see in almost every dashboard. It comes up in almost every sprint reviews if you do sprints. The numbers, right? The numbers that make us feel like we're improving. We're getting better at something. And I think those numbers are often lying. And that's not because I think metrics are bad. In fact, I love metrics. I'm a huge fan of data and data-driven decisions and all that. However, the problem with that is, often our metrics don't really show us what's going on, they show us what we want to see. And by doing so, they hide what is really going on. So what I would like is for you to be able to go away from this session today and having a really simple formula, if you will, to tell whether a metric you're collecting is actually helping your team getting better, or whether it is just what I call a vanity metric, a metric that makes you look good. So I started here with a few really familiar metrics, right? Test coverage, bug counts, cycle time, and they're everywhere. You can get them from Jira, or maybe you're using TestRail, Grafana, SonarQube, right? And they look really professional and reassuring. They're easy to measure. They're easy to compare. And they do make us feel like we are on top of things. We know what's going on, right? Huh? However, that something is easy to track doesn't really mean it's delivering any value. It's a little bit like you're feeling a little bit unwell, you think, I should be getting healthier. Maybe I need more exercise, right? So you get a step counter, start counting your steps. But what if what you really need is more sleep? Step count is not going to help with that, right? So activity is not necessarily the same as improvement. A real example from my work in consultancy, I worked in consultancy for quite a few years. And a company I worked with had a reward system for their testers. And they rewarded them for two things: how many test cases they executed, and how many bugs they logged. Now, what can possibly go wrong with that, huh? Anybody here seen that? Yeah, exactly. So it was perfect logic on paper. But of course, it kind of fell apart within a few sprints, right? Suddenly, test cases became every step was a new test case. So we had many more test cases to execute. Trivial bugs exploded, right? Something that could be easily one bug report became 5 bug reports, because that's what they encouraged, right? So they had built a system that rewarded activity over insight. I have seen the same pattern with teams who track the number of test cases executed as an overall measure of their quality. Because surely, right, more test cases is better? Not necessarily. I have worked with teams who had 50-case test suites that were a whole lot more effective than test suites of 50,000. Right? Because it doesn't matter how many tests you run. What matters is, at the end of the day, what information do you get out of that? If you have 50,000 test cases, those test cases, most of them didn't test anything of significance. Right? They were noise. It's just noise. It creates a lot of overhead to maintain that. It creates a lot of work. Somebody has to go through. You will have a lot of false positives. A lot of time is spent on maintenance, on figuring out, is that failure a bug? This company was also really fond of using screenshot comparisons. Anybody use screenshot comparison tests here? Yeah. So we had this one poor person who came in every morning to work, had to sit down, look at the errors or the kind of, failures from the test run overnight, overnight test runs. I have a whole talk on that as well. And then he had to sit there and look at the screenshots and saying, is that a bug? Oh no, it's just this pixel over here that didn't render quite correctly. That person left the company fairly soon because he just lost the will to live, and I cannot blame him. Or maybe you count how many bugs you find before a release. Because higher bug counts, surely better. Yes? Yes? No. 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 Higher bug counts just mean you have introduced more issues earlier on upstream in the process, and now you find them. That doesn't mean the quality has gotten better. Probably it means the quality has gotten worse, in fact. Right? So I will talk a little bit about ratio versus absolute metrics a little bit later on. But if I want a meaningful signal, then I need proportions. I don't need just raw numbers. That doesn't tell me much, generally speaking. So, quick throwback to you. If you think about a metrics you are tracking at work, one metric that kind of shows up in reports you write, right? And you think back to when that metric has led to you changing a decision you made the last time, and you can't come up with anything for the second part. Keep that metric in mind. Think about it. Okay? Hold it in the back of your head there. So I have this framework, which I call QED. It's, things need to have names, blah, blah. And the shift that I want to make with that is just give you a framework that moves stuff from reporting to learning. So we're now using our metrics to learn something, not just to write a report that probably nobody's going to read anyways. Right? I also have opinions on reports, but I have opinions on many things. So that is not really surprising to anybody who has talked to me for about 3 seconds. So, what I really like, because I grew up in a DevOps environment, really, and when I say grew up, I mean professionally, not in, I like short cycles. I like lightweight, meaningful data that allows us to make a clear decision. And you will find probably some topics that Rob touched upon in his keynote last night reflected in my talk, because a lot of that resonated very much with what I think about these things. So we're going to start with questions. It matters what question you are trying to answer. The question comes before the metric, not the metric before the question, right? You have to decide, what is it that I need an answer for? What is it that I want to know? Vanity metrics, or what I call vanity metrics, they will give you some information about how busy you are. Right? That is not very useful. I want a question that tells me what hurts quality and what helps improve quality. That is what I'm after. We are quality people after all, right? And if you have a shallow question, then that question will give you shallow data. And that will lead to shallow conversations. That's not what we need. We need something that really helps us make a decision, that helps us improve our product. Because again, and this is something I very much agree with Rob on, right? At the end of the day, our main job is not to protect quality. Our job is to make money for the company so that the company can stay alive and grow and continue paying us. And when we talk about money in the business sense, there are only 2 kinds of money. Money that comes in and money that goes out. And we want to be on the side of the money that comes in and not the cost center, right? So for that, I use a really, really simple formula. However, test coverage. Who here tracks test coverage? Do you think it's a useful metric? Yeah, I see some thumbs up, some I think it can be a valuable metric if you look at it as a signal that shows you where you may need to pay more attention, right? If you have an area of code that has very bad test coverage and you see a lot of defects out of that area of code, then you know you have a problem, where the problem is and what you need to do something about it, right? But generally speaking, I think test coverage is a bit of a vanity metrics. Because whether you have 60% test coverage, or 80%, or 90%, or dare I say it, 100, it doesn't tell me anything about the quality of your tests. I have also worked with teams who wrote a whole bunch of completely meaningless tests. My favorite is still test name something something, pass. The test did exactly nothing other than pass. For test coverage, right? That is no value. That is vanity. Whereas stakeholders have different questions, right? They will want to know what area of the product causes us problems. Where do we need to rework? Where do we need to go back and do something about it? So if you frame it that way, then people will listen to you in a different way. So the formula I mentioned before. The formula I like to use is issue, impact, business connection. So the issue describes something I can observe and I think is problematic, but I try to describe it without analyzing it, without offering a solution. I just say, this happens, right? Impact is the consequence of that issue. So maybe, something, I will give you some examples going forward. However, it is really at the core of it, the impact is, why should anybody care about that? Think back to the two types of money, in or out. That is usually why somebody else other than you will care. It makes us money, it costs us money. Right? And then that leads us to the business connection. So now we have a framework that we can use. So for example, to ascertain what the issue is, I ask what is happening. I don't ask what's causing this, I don't ask why it's hurt, it's just what is happening. So for example, I try to pick things that I've seen happen fairly frequently. Maybe you get stories and the acceptance criteria are not entirely clear. I mean, how many of you get perfect acceptance criteria in every story you work with? No? No? Yeah, me neither. So that is a fairly, neutral observation. Then we look at, why does this matter? Right? It doesn't matter because it annoys me personally, which it does. Right? It doesn't matter because I don't like talking to the developers or the BAs or something. It matters because it's costing us time. It leads to rework. We may be building the wrong stuff. Things arrive with us as testers maybe, and we test something with assumption about what it should be, and it turns out that is not what the developer thought it should be. And neither of those two things are what the product owner thought it should be. Right? So the whole thing goes back, we need to do it again, cycle, rework. That is money out the door. That is not money in. That is not a positive thing. So you really impact is the bridge from I noticed a thing to this is what it's costing us. And then you want to make that a little bit more explicit by linking it to business outcomes. Right? So for example, we had the rework, right? And now this is affecting our ability to deliver in a sprint what we promised to deliver. That breaks stakeholder values or breaks stakeholder trust. That means our Quality may be affected. Our customers start to distrust us because we now can't deliver in the cycles we have promised to them, right? So that then gets a little bit more attention because now we are connecting this to a business outcome. We are still a business, we are still money out, and we are still not money in, right? Not a great thing. Back to the test coverage, right? You often hear the "we need more test coverage," this kind of blanket statement. But that isn't explicit enough. If you can, however, say, so we have a whole bunch of checkout failures that's causing us X% of abandonment in cart, people are not checking out, they're not giving us their money, that's what we want, right? Because we're not testing that area well enough, then that makes a business case for you to spend time in that area and fix your test coverage. Not because you think it should be 80%, because you've read that in some blog. So, that metrics that I asked you to think about earlier, now think about if you retired that one metric tomorrow and you would never ever measure it again, would that make a difference? Right? So now we have decided what question we want to ask. Now we need to collect the metric. We need to decide what metric we want to collect. We are looking for a signal that gives us information that helps us answer the question, and we want ideally to do that with tools we already use. I really like to find the easiest way to get the information that I want. That is most often not a new tool, that is not a new dashboard, that's not building a data warehouse. I just need a signal that tells me enough on whether my assumption about this is correct or not. Because if it is, then we can, and I will talk about that in the develop step, then we can start fixing it. Anyways. So again, back to reality, another team I worked with, they had a success metric that was bugs resolved per sprint. They thought that's a great metric to encourage people to address some of their tech debt, right? Because you know how it goes. You write all of these bug tickets, they get thrown into the backlog to never ever be seen again, and every once in a while somebody says, yeah, no, you don't need to file that bug again, there are already 12 tickets about it, right? So they thought maybe if we make that a success metric. Well, of course, what happened was clear, right? So people starting, again, logging more trivial issues, developers preferred picking those up over more complex issues, because that would take longer, right? So they all bumped their own personal metrics. Unfortunately, though, for the product, that meant quality took a bit of a nosedive. Because, and I think Martin, sorry, I butchered the name again, actually practiced, there you go, mentioned this a little bit, metrics drive behaviors. What you measure matters, because people will react in a way that it feeds into what they think you want them to provide. Every metric, whether we want it or not, creates a behavior. If we reward volume, we will get volume. If, however, we reward prevention and learning, then that is what we will get. And I was going to tell you about the Cobra effect. Martin did that already, so I'm going to skip that. If you want to look it up, it's a really cool story. I heard about it on a podcast called Freakonomics, also highly recommended. It's also known as a perverse incentive. Anyways, so if you look at the metrics that we want to measure, we have direct metrics and we have proxy metrics. Direct metrics, fairly self-explanatory, right? They measure the thing directly. So I'm going to give you an example of that on the next slide. Proxy metrics measure a signal that is connected to the outcome we are looking for. That's not a direct metric, and both are fine. A lot of people tend to prefer direct metrics. I don't really care, as long as I know why I'm measuring what I'm measuring and what I'm hoping to get from it. Right? Both can be really useful. So a direct metric here, the example is you want to improve the stability of your releases because you found that they're a little bit wonky, right? So easy direct metrics is you measure how many times you need to do a hotfix after a release, right? Very, very straightforward. A proxy metric around that could be you look how many last-minute merges you have, because the higher that number is, the more likely it is you will have to release a hotfix as well, because people under pressure and in a rush usually don't work as well as they do when they have time. Right? So that's a proxy. It isn't directly related, but it still gives you really useful information. And then, we have misleading versus useful metrics. Some metrics just look really impressive, but they don't change anything. If a metric doesn't lead you to make a different choice, personally, I think that is a report and not a tool. Right? So ask yourself, what is this enabling me to do? Test case counts. I will come back to that, sorry. I hate them. I often worked with POs who ask me, how many test cases do you have? And I'm like, I don't know. But how many of them do pass or fail? So they all pass or we don't merge. So I don't really care. Anyways, so I think proportion is a better idea. You probably want to know how many bugs you discover, say in a sprint, but what you really want to know is where do you discover these bugs? Because it may be that you're really good at discovering these bugs at the coding stage, right? So if you work with developers who write a lot of unit tests, then ideally most of your bugs are found in that stage, and you won't see many bug reports, because I don't want them to stop what they're doing to write a report, found bug in unit test, fixing thing now. They will never show up in any report. So a lower number may actually mean you have a much higher quality. And lastly, we have the develop step. And that is then where we turn this insight into action. One of my favorites, we have to improve test coverage. That is a horrible, horrible incentive, right? What does it even mean? How do I know that I'm doing this better? Is 85 better than 83? Maybe it's more, right? So what you really want is to pick a very specific action out of this, and in this example, it's add one test to each critical path story. And then you can measure how that impacts your release stability, for example, right? So then you can start connecting the dots. Sorry, I'm behind my slides. That happens sometimes. Once you have done that, once you have dialed in a little bit on something you want to change, so let's say we are now adding one critical path test to everything, right? Then we can look, this is help. Or maybe we are doing a check in every planning meeting where we ask everybody, are the acceptance criteria fine? And we count how many tickets now get ping-ponged. We heard the ping-pong game yesterday here as well, right? And if that number drops, we're probably doing fine, and it's a good check, and it helps us. And then maybe you want to scale it out to other teams. If it's easy, let other people do it as well. Maybe, however, we don't really know. Some tickets now go faster, other tickets went back again, and we don't really get a clear signal. Then we have to ask ourselves, is this helpful? We can pivot. Let's change something. Or maybe it's doing exactly nothing for us, and then we abandon it. Sometimes these experiments can be tiny. I really like a release confidence check, right? Ask your team, if we had to release this right now, how do you feel about it? Great? Maybe? God, no. Right? Takes 10 seconds, tells you something. So I think your metrics are often lying, but they don't have to. Hence, question, evidence, develop. Get some facts, right? Ask yourself, what is it I'm trying to do here? Answer a question. Ask a question, answer a question, change your behavior. Anybody know where the QED comes from scientifically? Yeah, quod erat demonstrandum. That was which was to be proven. So that's kind of what inspired me here. Vanity metrics make us look good. Value metrics help us change decisions. And with that, I think my time is over. Last slide. There you go. Well, almost last slide. If you want to download the thing, it's free. Yes, I will ask for your email. Yes, you will hear from me again. Yes, you can immediately unsubscribe. Absolutely no hard feelings. Right? If you want to connect to me on LinkedIn, I would love it. Tell me your stories. I love to hear what people do with this. And that was it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for talking. Okay, let's see some questions that you've got. Can you provide an example for a test coverage matrix that is based on learning and that will be convincing for stakeholders if used for reporting?
I think test coverage, again, is in almost all cases useless. Sorry. I cannot change my mind on that. It is the only useful use case for test coverage I have ever seen is to alert me to areas of code that need more tests. The way you argue that is you show people what happens, what impact it has to your bottom line that you have bugs in that area. And that is how you convince people that you need to spend time there making it better.
Okay. As an engineer, how can you make the management change their mindset about the lying metrics?
Well, so in consultancy, I have been taught one thing, right? So customers think they know what they need. They certainly know what they want. If you are a consultant, you go in and you tell them, yeah, I give you what you want, but then you sneakily give them what they need. Okay? And that's what you do with your managers. You tell, yeah, sure, this is what you want, but look, I have this other thing here. Look at that. Right? And once they realize that that allows them to make better decisions, they will want it. Just make it really clear and easy for them. Here's where the money comes in. We don't want to throw it out here, yeah? So.
No, we don't. What is your favorite metric?
That very much depends on the context. My favorite metric, however, if it can be a little bit meta, is a metric that's easy to obtain and immediately gives me a yes or no, the ability to make a yes or no answer. Right?
Okay. What is the best way to align metrics with the organization's KPIs?
Let's see. I think a lot of what Rob said yesterday was very, very on topic here. Again, and we heard this earlier this morning as well, know the KPIs, speak with your managers, and translate them into something that you can actually actively work towards. That may not be the same thing that is named in the KPI, but there will be something you can do towards that KPI.
Can you provide an example of what metrics were actually tracked and how that influenced concrete decisions?
Well, so for example, I used to, when I built my first independent dashboard as a consultant, I was very much one of them, said, look, we have all this data. Look, I put this on, and we had about 5 different microservices. So I wanted to track metrics from each of those 5 different microservices. My team lead came and said, can you delete all that crap? I'm like, what? So what we measured in the end was how many people entered our sign-up flow and how many people left our sign-up flow successfully. And then that led to a complete redesign of the login, of the sign-up page. Right? So that's a very straightforward example.
You're done, ladies and gentlemen. Katja, Obring, amazing job.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.